I'm Sarah Martinez, 27 years old, and I thought I understood family loyalty until the day my parents handed over my grandfather's inheritance to my older brother without even telling me. What happened next changed everything I believed about justice, family, and the power of one phone call that would turn our world upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the Martinez household in suburban Denver meant understanding your place in an invisible hierarchy that nobody talked about, but everyone felt. My brother Daniel was born 3 years before me, arriving into a world of celebrations, professional photography sessions, and walls lined with his baby pictures. When I came along, the excitement had settled into routine, and the photo albums became noticeably thinner. Daniel was everything my parents dreamed of in a firstborn son. He was naturally athletic, effortlessly charismatic, and possessed the kind of confidence that made teachers remember his name and coaches fight over him for their teams. By the time he was in middle school, our living room mantle had become a shrine to his achievements. Soccer trophies, academic awards, and certificates of excellence created a golden display that caught the light every morning when the sun streamed through our front windows. I learned early that my role was to be the supportive younger sister, the one who cheered from the sidelines and never competed for the spotlight that seemed to follow Daniel wherever he went. When he scored the winning goal in his championship game, I was expected to celebrate. When he was accepted into the honor society, I was supposed to be proud. When he received a full scholarship to Colorado State University, I was meant to feel grateful that our family had produced such success. My own accomplishments existed in a different category entirely. When I made honor roll semester after semester, it was acknowledged with a brief nod and the expectation that this was simply what I was supposed to do. When I won the regional science fair with my project on renewable energy solutions, my mother mentioned it once to her sister over coffee, treating it like an interesting coincidence rather than months of dedicated research and experimentation. The pattern became so familiar that I stopped expecting recognition and started finding validation elsewhere. I threw myself into activities that Daniel had no interest in pursuing. I joined the debate team, became editor of the school newspaper, and spent my weekends volunteering at the local animal shelter. These pursuits gave me a sense of identity separate from being Daniel's little sister, even though they rarely earned the kind of attention that his athletic achievements commanded at home. My relationship with my grandfather, Roberto Martinez, became my refuge during those years of feeling invisible in my own family. Grandpa Roberto had immigrated from Mexico in his 20s with nothing but determination and a fierce work ethic that eventually built a successful construction company. He understood what it meant to fight for recognition, to prove yourself when others doubted your worth. Every Saturday, I would take the city bus across town to visit him in his small but immaculate house near the old downtown district. His living room smelled like coffee and the aftershave he had worn for decades, and his kitchen table was always covered with blueprints, business documents, and the financial newspapers he read religiously every morning. Grandpa Roberto treated me like I had a brain worth engaging. He asked about my classes not to make polite conversation, but because he genuinely wanted to understand what I was learning. When I told him about my science projects, he listened with the same intensity he brought to studying market reports. He never compared me to Daniel or suggested that my interests were less valuable than my brother's athletic pursuits. During one particularly memorable conversation when I was 15, he told me something that would stay with me for years. We were sitting on his back porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, when he set down his coffee cup and looked at me seriously. "Mija," he said, using the Spanish endearment that always made me feel special. "I see how hard you work, how much you care about learning and helping others. Your parents, they love you, but sometimes they don't see what's right in front of them. They think success only looks one way, but I know better." He paused, studying my face with those sharp brown eyes that seemed to see everything. "I've been watching you grow up, and I see strength in you that reminds me of myself when I was young. You don't give up, even when things are hard. That's going to take you places that trophies never could." His words meant more to me than any award I had ever received because they came from someone who understood struggle and recognized the value of persistence over natural talent. Grandpa Roberto had built his life from nothing, and he saw in me the same determination that had carried him through decades of challenges. As I got older, our relationship deepened beyond the typical grandparent-grandchild dynamic. He began including me in conversations about his business, explaining how he had grown his construction company from a one-man operation to a firm that employed over 50 people. He taught me about financial planning, investment strategies, and the importance of building something that would last beyond your own lifetime. During my junior year of high school, Grandpa Roberto started talking about his will and estate planning, with a matter-of-fact tone that initially made me uncomfortable. He explained that he had worked hard to accumulate assets that could provide security for his family long after he was gone. His construction company, several rental properties, and his investment portfolio represented a lifetime of careful planning and sacrifice. "I want to make sure my money goes to the people who will use it wisely," he told me one afternoon, as we reviewed some of his financial statements together. "Not everyone understands the value of money or how to make it work for them. I've been watching my grandchildren grow up, and I have strong opinions about who has the judgment to handle real responsibility." At the time, I assumed he was including both Daniel and me in his considerations. It never occurred to me that he might have already formed definitive opinions about our respective characters and capabilities. I was focused on my college applications and the overwhelming process of choosing a future path while managing my parents' expectations and my own dreams. Daniel's senior year of high school coincided with my sophomore year, and the contrast in how our achievements were celebrated became even more pronounced. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His college recruitment visits were treated like family holidays, with my parents driving him to campus tours and meeting with coaches who courted him with promises of starting positions and professional prospects. Meanwhile, I was quietly building an academic record that would eventually earn me early acceptance to several prestigious universities, including a partial scholarship to study environmental engineering at the University of Colorado. When I received my acceptance letter, I remember running to the kitchen to share the news with my mother, who was busy preparing Daniel's favorite dinner to celebrate his latest soccer victory. "That's wonderful, honey," she said, barely looking up from the stove. "Make sure you tell your father when he gets home. He'll be so pleased." The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds before she returned to discussing Daniel's upcoming playoff game and the logistics of coordinating family attendance. The disparity in attention and enthusiasm wasn't lost on me, but I had learned to find satisfaction in my own accomplishments rather than seeking validation from parents who seemed incapable of recognizing achievement that didn't fit their predetermined definitions of success. Grandpa Roberto's pride in my academic progress provided the encouragement I needed to stay motivated despite feeling overlooked at home. During my senior year, as I prepared for college and tried to figure out how to finance my education with minimal family support, Grandpa Roberto began dropping hints about his estate planning that I didn't fully understand at the time. He would make comments about young people who wasted opportunities or family members who assumed they were entitled to things they hadn't earned. "Money reveals character," he told me during one of our Saturday visits. "Give someone more than they can handle, and you'll see their true nature pretty quickly. Give someone less than they deserve, and you'll see their strength." His observations seemed philosophical rather than practical, and I filed them away as the wisdom of someone who had seen enough of life to understand human nature. The summer before I started college, Grandpa Roberto's health began declining, noticeably. The man who had always seemed invincible, who had worked construction sites well into his 60s and maintained his own house with meticulous care, started moving more slowly and experiencing fatigue that concerned our entire family. My parents coordinated his medical appointments and began discussing the possibility that he might need assisted living arrangements. Daniel, who was home from his sophomore year at Colorado State, made a few perfunctory visits, but seemed uncomfortable with the realities of aging and illness. I found myself spending even more time at Grandpa Roberto's house, helping with grocery shopping, organizing his medications, and simply providing companionship during what we all knew might be his final months. During these visits, our conversations took on a different quality. He spoke more about the past, sharing stories about my grandmother, who had died when I was young, and reflecting on the choices he had made throughout his life. He also talked more specifically about his wishes for his estate, though he remained cryptic about the exact details of his will. "I've made decisions that some people in the family won't understand," he told me one evening as we sat in his living room, the light fading outside his windows. "But I've thought long and hard about what's fair and what's smart. Sometimes those two things aren't the same, but I think I've found a way to honor both." When I asked what he meant, he just patted my hand and changed the subject. At the time, I assumed he was referring to the complex logistics of dividing assets among multiple family members, a process that seemed overwhelming and emotionally charged for someone who valued harmony and fairness. Grandpa Roberto passed away peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in late October, just 2 months into my freshman year at college. I received the call from my mother while I was in my dorm room studying for a chemistry exam, and the news hit me like a physical blow. The man who had been my strongest supporter, my mentor, and my refuge from family dynamics that often left me feeling invisible, was gone. I flew home for the funeral, taking my first absence from college classes, and spending money I couldn't afford on a last-minute plane ticket. The service was beautiful, filled with friends, business associates, and family members who shared stories about Grandpa Roberto's generosity, work ethic, and impact on their lives. I spoke briefly about his encouragement of my education and his pride in my academic achievements, trying to capture in a few minutes the depth of a relationship that had shaped my entire adolescence. After the funeral, our family gathered at my parents' house for the traditional meal and reminiscing that follows such occasions. It was during this gathering that my father mentioned that Grandpa Roberto's lawyer, a man named David Harrison, would be reading the will the following week. The announcement was casual, mentioned between discussions of flower arrangements and thank you cards, as if the distribution of a lifetime's accumulation of wealth was just another administrative detail to be handled. I returned to college the next day, emotionally exhausted but grateful to lose myself in coursework and the demanding routine of freshman year. I assumed that whatever inheritance Grandpa Roberto had left would be divided among his children and grandchildren in some traditional manner, probably providing modest support for college expenses or future down payments on houses. The phone call came on a Thursday evening while I was in the library working on a research paper about sustainable urban development. My mother's voice sounded strange when I answered, emotional in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk about Grandpa Roberto's will," she began, her words careful and measured. "There were some surprises in the reading today, and your father and I think it's best if we explain the situation to you directly." My first thought was that something had gone wrong with the legal process, that there were debts or complications that would reduce or eliminate any inheritance. I braced myself for disappointment, already calculating how this might affect my college financing and future plans. "Grandpa Roberto left his construction company to Daniel," my mother continued, her voice gaining strength as she delivered what seemed like good news. "He also left him the rental properties and the majority of the investment portfolio. Your father and I are so proud of Daniel. This is going to set him up for life." I felt genuinely happy for my brother, even as I wondered what this meant for the rest of us. Grandpa Roberto's business was valuable, and the rental income from his properties would provide ongoing financial security. Daniel had always been the golden child, so it made sense that he would receive the bulk of the inheritance, especially since he had shown interest in business and real estate during his college years. What about everyone else? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral and supportive. Did he leave something for the other grandchildren? There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long, and I could hear my father's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out his words. When my mother spoke again, her tone had shifted to something that sounded almost apologetic. Well, honey, Grandpa Roberto's will was very specific about his intentions. He wanted to make sure the business and properties stayed intact, so he left them entirely to Daniel. There were some smaller bequests to other family members, but the bulk of the estate went to ensuring that Daniel could take over the construction company successfully. The explanation sounded reasonable, even generous toward Daniel, but something in my mother's tone suggested there was more to the story. I waited for her to continue, to explain what this meant for me specifically, but the silence stretched, uncomfortably. Mom, did Grandpa Roberto leave anything for me? I asked directly, tired of trying to read between the lines of a conversation that seemed deliberately vague. Another pause, longer this time, followed by what sounded like a deep breath. He left you a letter, sweetheart. A personal letter that Mr. Harrison said was very important to him. And he wanted you to know how proud he was of your academic achievements and your character. A letter. My grandfather, who had built a multi-million-dollar business empire and accumulated substantial wealth over decades of hard work, had left me a letter while giving my brother everything of financial value. The disparity was so stark, so unexpected, that I couldn't immediately process what it meant. Just a letter? I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. I know it's disappointing, honey, my mother said, her words rushing together as if speed could soften the blow. But you have to understand, Grandpa Roberto was thinking about keeping the business in the family, and Daniel has the experience and connections to run it successfully. He's been working construction jobs during his summers, and he understands that world in a way that would be harder for you to learn. The rationalization felt hollow, especially coming from someone who had never shown much interest in Grandpa Roberto's business while he was alive. My mother had always treated his construction company as something vaguely embarrassing, work that was necessary but not prestigious enough to feature prominently in her social conversations. Besides, she continued, warming to her theme, you're doing so well in college, and you'll have your degree to rely on. Daniel needs this opportunity to establish himself, and your grandfather knew that. He was always thinking about what each person needed most. I hung up the phone feeling emotionally hollowed out, not just by the inheritance situation, but by my mother's easy acceptance of what seemed like a fundamental unfairness. The letter she had mentioned felt more like a consolation prize than a meaningful bequest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was being left out of the explanation. That night, I lay in my narrow dorm bed staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. Grandpa Roberto had always treated me with respect and encouraged my ambitions. He had seemed genuinely proud of my academic achievements and had never suggested that my goals were less worthy than Daniel's athletic pursuits. Why would he leave me virtually nothing while giving my brother everything? The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. My parents' explanation focused on Daniel's readiness to take over the construction business, but Grandpa Roberto had never expressed any particular confidence in my brother's business acumen. In fact, during our Saturday conversations, he had occasionally made pointed comments about young people who expected success without understanding the work required to achieve it. I remembered his words about money revealing character and his observations about people who wasted opportunities. Had he somehow changed his opinion of me during his final months? Had I done something to disappoint him without realizing it? The uncertainty was almost worse than the financial loss, threatening my understanding of one of the most important relationships in my life. Over the following days, I found it difficult to concentrate on my coursework or engage with my dorm mates, typical college concerns. The inheritance situation consumed my thoughts, not because I had expected to receive substantial money, but because the disparity seemed so inconsistent with the grandfather I thought I knew. I called Daniel to congratulate him on his inheritance, hoping that a direct conversation might provide some clarity about the situation. His reaction was oddly defensive rather than celebratory, as if he felt the need to justify receiving what amounted to a windfall that would set him up for life. "I mean, it makes sense, right?" he said after I offered my congratulations. "I've been working construction since high school, and I understand the business side of things. Grandpa Roberto always said that the company needed someone who could step right in and keep it running." His explanation echoed our parents' reasoning, but something in his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Daniel had worked summer construction jobs, but he had never shown particular aptitude for business management or expressed serious interest in taking over Grandpa Roberto's company permanently. "What about the letter he left me?" I asked, curious about whether Daniel knew anything about its contents. "Oh, that," he said, his voice becoming even more uncomfortable. "Mr. Harrison has it. I guess it's pretty long, like several pages. He said Grandpa Roberto spent a lot of time working on it before he died. The fact that my grandfather had invested significant effort in writing me a lengthy letter suggested that it contained more than simple condolences or generic encouragement. Perhaps the letter would explain his reasoning or provide some context that would help me understand his decisions." 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived at my dorm, addressed in careful handwriting that I recognized as Mr. Harrison's. Inside was a cover letter from the lawyer explaining that my grandfather had specifically requested that this correspondence be delivered exactly 30 days after the will reading, and a sealed envelope marked with my name in Grandpa Roberto's distinctive writing. I took the letter to a quiet corner of the campus library, away from the distractions of my dorm and the curious eyes of my roommate. Breaking the seal felt momentous, like opening a door to a conversation with someone I would never see again. The letter was indeed several pages long, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting on the letterhead from his construction company. As I began reading, I could almost hear his voice speaking the words, and tears blurred my vision before I had finished the first paragraph. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this letter, then my time on earth has ended, and you have learned about the provisions of my will. I know that the inheritance I have left you may seem small compared to what your brother received, and I want you to understand my reasoning, not just for the decisions I made, but for the bigger picture that I couldn't share with anyone while I was alive." The letter continued with words that would change everything I thought I understood about my family and my grandfather's final wishes. His handwriting remained steady and deliberate, each sentence carefully crafted to convey truths he had apparently been holding for years. "I need you to know that what happened at the will reading was not the complete picture. Your parents and Daniel believe they understand my intentions, but there are provisions in my estate planning that they are not yet aware of. I have structured my legacy in a way that will test character and reveal true intentions, and I suspect the results will surprise everyone involved." My hands trembled as I continued reading, the implications of his words beginning to dawn on me. Grandpa Roberto had orchestrated something far more complex than a simple inheritance distribution, and I was apparently a central figure in whatever plan he had devised. The construction company, the rental properties, and the investment accounts that Daniel received come with conditions that were not disclosed during the initial will reading. These conditions will be revealed to him over the coming months through a series of legal requirements that he must fulfill to maintain ownership of these assets. I have designed these requirements to test his commitment, responsibility, and understanding of what it truly means to earn something rather than simply receive it. The letter went on to explain that Daniel's inheritance was essentially a probationary arrangement, though he didn't know it yet. The assets had been transferred to him with specific performance benchmarks and behavioral expectations that would determine whether he could keep them permanently or whether they would revert to alternative arrangements that Grandpa Roberto had established. "I have been watching both of my grandchildren carefully throughout your lives, and I have seen clear differences in character, work ethic, and judgment. Daniel has been given many advantages and opportunities, but he has rarely been required to demonstrate real responsibility or face meaningful consequences for his choices. You, on the other hand, have consistently shown integrity, persistence, and the ability to succeed despite receiving less support and recognition. As I read these words, I felt a complicated mixture of validation and anxiety. Grandpa Roberto had apparently seen and valued qualities in me that my parents had consistently overlooked, but he had also placed me at the center of what seemed like an elaborate test of my brother's character. The letter you are holding is just the beginning of information you will receive about my true intentions. Mr. Harrison has been instructed to contact you in exactly 60 days from the date of this letter with additional details about your role in my estate planning. Until then, I need you to remain patient and trust that I have created a plan that will ultimately serve justice and reward merit. The letter concluded with personal reflections about our relationship and his hopes for my future, but my mind was reeling from the revelations about the conditional nature of Daniel's inheritance. Grandpa Roberto had essentially set up a scenario where my brother would be tested over time, and somehow my own inheritance was connected to the outcome of that test. I read the letter 3 more times, trying to understand all the implications, and wondering what specific conditions Daniel was supposed to meet. The knowledge felt both empowering and burdensome, especially since I was instructed to keep this information secret while watching my family celebrate what they believed was Daniel's permanent windfall. Returning to my dorm that evening, I struggled to process what I had learned and what it might mean for my relationship with my family. Daniel had apparently received his inheritance under false pretenses, believing it was an unconditional gift, when it was actually a trial period with requirements he wasn't even aware of. My parents had accepted the will reading as final, never questioning whether there might be additional provisions or conditions attached to such a substantial bequest. Over the following weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to family, phone calls, and conversations, looking for clues about how Daniel was handling his new responsibilities. From what I could gather, he had immediately begun making plans that suggested he viewed the inheritance as permanently his. He had left college to focus on taking over the construction company, had purchased an expensive new truck, and was talking about investing in additional properties to expand the real estate portfolio. My mother's updates during our weekly phone calls painted a picture of Daniel diving headfirst into his new role as a business owner, though her descriptions focused more on his enthusiasm than his competence. She mentioned that he had hired several new employees, was bidding on larger construction projects, and had started dating someone he described as a potential business partner who had her own real estate license. "Your brother is really coming into his own," she told me during one of these calls. "Your father and I are so proud of how he's stepped up to handle such big responsibilities. Grandpa Roberto would be so pleased to see how seriously Daniel is taking the business." I listened to these updates with growing concern, remembering my grandfather's comments about young people who assumed they were entitled to success without understanding the work required to maintain it. Daniel's rapid expansion and significant spending suggested someone who was operating under the assumption that his financial resources were unlimited and permanent. The 60-day deadline that Grandpa Roberto had mentioned in his letter became a fixed point in my consciousness, marked on my calendar with a significance that I couldn't share with anyone. As the date approached, I found myself both eager and anxious to learn what additional information Mr. Harrison would provide about my grandfather's true intentions. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was between classes, walking across campus in the crisp November air that reminded me of the mountain weather back home in Colorado. Mr. Harrison's voice was professional but warm, carrying the same tone of respect he had always shown when I accompanied Grandpa Roberto to his office for various business meetings. "Sarah, I hope you've had time to process the letter your grandfather left for you," he began. "I'm calling today because it's time for you to learn about the next phase of his estate planning and your role in ensuring that his final wishes are carried out properly." He explained that we needed to meet in person to review documents that couldn't be discussed over the phone, and he suggested that I plan to visit Denver during my upcoming Thanksgiving break. The timing would allow me to be present for what he described as a crucial evaluation period in Daniel's probationary ownership of the inherited assets. Your grandfather was very specific about the timeline for these revelations, Mr. Harrison continued. He wanted Daniel to have enough time to demonstrate his natural approach to responsibility and business management before external oversight was introduced. Based on what I've observed and the reports I've received, that evaluation period is now complete. I arranged to meet with him the day before Thanksgiving, scheduling the appointment during a time when my family would be busy with holiday preparations and less likely to question my whereabouts. The secrecy felt uncomfortable, but I was beginning to understand that Grandpa Roberto had designed this entire process to reveal truths that might not emerge under normal circumstances. Mr. Harrison's law office was located in an older building, downtown with dark wood paneling and leather furniture that suggested stability and tradition. When I arrived for our appointment, he greeted me with the same combination of professionalism and grandfatherly concern that had characterized his interactions with me throughout my grandfather's final years. "Before we begin," he said, settling behind his desk with a thick folder of documents, "I want you to understand that what I'm about to share with you will fundamentally change your understanding of your inheritance and your family's financial situation. Your grandfather was a very thoughtful man, but he was also strategic in ways that most people never realized. He opened the folder and withdrew a document that appeared to be an addendum to the original will, signed and notarized but dated, several weeks after the version that had been read to my family. This document outlined the conditional nature of Daniel's inheritance in explicit detail, including specific benchmarks he was required to meet and consequences for failing to satisfy those requirements. Your brother received the construction company, rental properties, and investment portfolio on a provisional basis," Mr. Harrison explained, pointing to relevant sections of the legal document. "He has 6 months to demonstrate fiscal responsibility, ethical business practices, and respect for the legacy your grandfather built. If he fails to meet these standards, the assets revert to a trust that your grandfather established with you as the primary beneficiary." The revelation hit me like a physical shock. My grandfather hadn't left me just a letter. He had potentially left me everything, contingent on Daniel's ability to prove himself worthy of the inheritance he believed he had already secured. The elaborate test wasn't just about Daniel's character. It was about ensuring that Grandpa Roberto's life's work went to someone who would honor his values and continue his legacy responsibly. "What specific requirements does Daniel need to meet?" I asked, trying to understand the practical implications of this arrangement. Mr. Harrison consulted another document, his finger tracing down a list of criteria that Grandpa Roberto had apparently spent considerable time developing. "The business must maintain profitability without taking on excessive debt. The rental properties must be properly maintained and managed ethically. The investment portfolio cannot be used for speculative or risky ventures. Most importantly, Daniel must demonstrate respect for employees, tenants, and business partners, conducting himself in a manner that honors your grandfather's reputation in the community." As he explained each requirement, I felt a growing sense of dread about Daniel's performance so far. Based on the updates I had received from my family, my brother had already violated several of these conditions through his rapid expansion, increased spending, and apparent disregard for the conservative business practices that had built Grandpa Roberto's success over decades. "How is Daniel's performance being monitored?" I asked, wondering how these abstract principles would be evaluated in practice. "Your grandfather established relationships with several independent parties who provide regular reports about the business operations, property management, and Daniel's conduct," Mr. Harrison replied. "These include the company's accountant, several long-term employees, property management professionals, and business associates who have worked with your grandfather for many years. None of them know about the conditional nature of the inheritance. but they've been asked to provide routine updates about the transition. He pulled out another folder, this one containing reports that painted a troubling picture of Daniel's first few months as the ostensible owner of Grandpa Roberto's business, Empire. The accountant reported significant cash flow problems due to aggressive expansion and increased payroll costs. Long-term employees described management decisions that prioritized short-term profits over the ethical standards that had defined the company's reputation. Property tenants had complained about deferred maintenance and rental increases that seemed designed to maximize revenue without regard for long-term relationships. The most concerning reports involved Daniel's treatment of employees and business partners, Mr. Harrison continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Several veteran workers have quit due to changes in working conditions and management style. There have been complaints about safety shortcuts and quality compromises that could damage the company's reputation and legal standing. As I reviewed the documentation, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and vindication. Sadness because Daniel was failing a test he didn't even know he was taking, potentially destroying something that Grandpa Roberto had spent his lifetime building. Vindication because my grandfather's assessment of our respective characters was proving accurate in ways that were both painful and revealing. "What happens next?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Your grandfather's instructions are very clear," Mr. Harrison replied. "Daniel has until the 6-month anniversary of the will reading to demonstrate that he can meet the established criteria. Based on the reports I've received, he is currently failing to satisfy most of the requirements. If his performance doesn't improve dramatically in the remaining time, the assets will transfer to the trust established for you." The magnitude of what this meant began to sink in. I could potentially inherit everything that Daniel thought was permanently his, but only if he continued to demonstrate the irresponsibility and poor judgment that had already become apparent in his management of Grandpa Roberto's legacy. "There's one more element to your grandfather's plan that you need to understand," Mr. Harrison continued, withdrawing a final document from the folder. "He wanted you to have the opportunity to intervene if you chose to do so. You can warn Daniel about the conditional nature of his inheritance and give him a chance to modify his behavior before the evaluation period ends." This revelation added another layer of complexity to an already emotionally charged situation. Grandpa Roberto had not only created a test of Daniel's character, but had also created a test of mine. Would I warn my brother about the conditions he was failing to meet, potentially sacrificing my own inheritance to give him a chance at redemption? Or would I remain silent and allow the consequences of his choices to unfold naturally? "Your grandfather believed that this choice would reveal something important about your own character," Mr. Harrison explained. "He wanted to see whether you would prioritize family loyalty or justice, whether you would choose personal gain or moral responsibility. There are no right or wrong answers, but your decision will affect the final distribution of his estate." I left that meeting feeling overwhelmed by the weight of knowledge and responsibility that Grandpa Roberto had placed on me. The inheritance situation was far more complex than I had imagined, involving not just money and property, but fundamental questions about family, fairness, and moral obligation. The drive back to my parents' house for Thanksgiving dinner felt surreal, knowing that I possessed information that would change everything for Daniel and potentially for our entire family. As I pulled into the familiar driveway, I could see my brother's expensive new truck parked prominently near the front door, a symbol of the confidence and entitlement that were apparently undermining his ability to honor our grandfather's legacy. Thanksgiving dinner unfolded with its typical mixture of family traditions and underlying tensions, but this year I found myself observing the dynamics with new awareness. Daniel dominated conversation with stories about his business ventures, his tone suggesting someone who had never questioned his right to the success he was enjoying. My parents listened with the same admiring attention they had always given his achievements, never asking probing questions about sustainability or long-term planning. When the conversation turned to Grandpa Roberto's memory, Daniel spoke confidently about continuing his legacy and expanding the business in ways that would have made the old man proud. His certainty was both touching and painful, given what I knew about how far his management style had already diverged from the principles that had built the company's reputation. "I've been thinking about adding a landscaping division," Daniel announced as we shared dessert. "There's a lot of money in high-end residential work, and I've got connections with some developers who could send us regular business. Grandpa Roberto always said you have to think big if you want to succeed." My father nodded approvingly, while my mother asked questions about the potential for growth and profit. No one mentioned the risks associated with rapid expansion or the importance of maintaining the quality standards that had distinguished Grandpa Roberto's work in a competitive market. As I listened to these conversations, I found myself thinking about the reports Mr. Harrison had shared with me. Daniel's enthusiasm for expansion matched exactly the kind of short-sighted thinking that had already created cash flow problems and employee dissatisfaction. He was repeating mistakes without any awareness that his performance was being evaluated or that his inheritance was contingent on demonstrating better judgment. After dinner, I found myself alone with Daniel in the kitchen as we cleaned up, and the opportunity for private conversation felt both precious and dangerous. This could be my chance to warn him about the conditions attached to his inheritance, to give him the information he needed to change course before it was too late. "How are things really going with the business?" I asked, trying to sound casual, while probing for information about his awareness of any problems. "Great, really great," he replied, loading dishes into the dishwasher with the same confidence he brought to all discussions of his new responsibilities. "I mean, there have been some growing pains, and a few of the old-timers haven't adapted well to my management style, but that's normal when you're making improvements to outdated systems." His dismissal of employee concerns as resistance to change rather than legitimate feedback about problematic policies revealed how disconnected he was from the reality of his situation. The veteran workers who had quit weren't opposed to progress. They were objecting to practices that violated the ethical standards Grandpa Roberto had established over decades of building trust in the community. "What kind of improvements are you making?" I asked, curious about whether he had any awareness of how his changes were being perceived. "Efficiency stuff, mostly," Daniel said, his tone suggesting he was pleased with his innovations. "Shorter deadlines, cheaper materials when the client won't notice, larger crews to handle more projects simultaneously. The old guys were stuck in this mindset where every job had to be perfect, but sometimes good enough is actually good enough. You know?" His explanation revealed exactly the kind of thinking that would horrify Grandpa Roberto, who had built his reputation on craftsmanship and reliability rather than corner-cutting and volume-based profits. Daniel was systematically dismantling the values that had made the business successful, apparently without any understanding of why those values had mattered in the first place. As we finished cleaning the kitchen, I wrestled with the decision that Grandpa Roberto had ultimately placed in my hands. Daniel was failing his probationary period through choices that reflected his fundamental misunderstanding of what had made our grandfather successful. Warning him about the consequences might give him a chance to change course, but it would also feel like betraying Grandpa Roberto's intention to test our characters under natural circumstances. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of family, activities, and internal turmoil as I considered my options. I could warn Daniel and potentially sacrifice my inheritance to give him a chance at redemption. I could remain silent and allow the consequences of his choices to unfold according to Grandpa Roberto's original plan. Or I could try to find some middle ground that honored both family loyalty and the justice that my grandfather had tried to establish. By Sunday evening, as I prepared to return to college, I had made my decision about how to handle the knowledge I possessed. The choice felt both inevitable and terrifying, but it aligned with the values that Grandpa Roberto had seen in me and the principles he had spent years teaching me about character, responsibility, and the importance of earning what you receive. The drive back to campus gave me time to think through the implications of my decision and to prepare for the phone call I would need to make to Mr. Harrison. Grandpa Roberto had created a complex test of character for both his grandchildren, and I was about to demonstrate which values would guide my choices when faced with difficult moral decisions. As I pulled into the parking lot outside my dormitory, I realized that the next few months would determine not just the distribution of my grandfather's wealth, but the kind of person I would prove myself to be when tested by circumstances I had never imagined facing. The inheritance was no longer just about money. It had become a measure of integrity, family loyalty, and moral courage that would shape my understanding of myself for years to come. The following weeks brought a strange sense of living in two different realities simultaneously. In one reality, I was a college freshman dealing with typical concerns about finals, winter break plans, and the social dynamics of dormitory life. In the other reality, I was sitting on information that would fundamentally alter my family's understanding of wealth, inheritance, and the true nature of my grandfather's final wishes. I found myself paying closer attention to every family phone call, analyzing my parents' updates about Daniel's business ventures, and looking for signs that anyone else suspected the provisional nature of his inheritance. My mother continued to share stories about his successes with obvious pride, describing new projects and partnerships that sounded impressive, but concerned me given what I knew about the evaluation criteria he was unknowingly failing to meet. Daniel closed a huge contract with a residential development company, she told me during one of our weekly conversations. He's going to be building 50 houses over the next year. Your father says it's exactly the kind of opportunity that will establish him as a major player in the construction industry. The news should have been cause for celebration, but I knew enough about construction management to recognize the risks associated with such rapid scaling. Grandpa Roberto had grown his business gradually, building reputation and capacity in careful increments that ensured quality control and financial stability. Daniel's aggressive expansion suggested someone who was prioritizing short-term revenue over the sustainable growth that had characterized our grandfather's approach. December brought final exams and the distraction of intense studying, but I couldn't completely escape the anxiety about the situation unfolding at home. Mr. Harrison had mentioned that the 6-month evaluation period would conclude in early February, meaning that Daniel had only 2 more months to demonstrate the responsible stewardship that would allow him to keep his inheritance permanently. During winter break, I had the opportunity to observe Daniel's management style more directly when I visited the construction company's main office to see how the business was operating under his leadership. The changes were immediately apparent, from the expensive new office furniture to the significantly larger staff to the general atmosphere of rapid expansion and aggressive ambition. Daniel gave me a tour of the facilities with obvious pride, pointing out improvements he had made to equipment and workspace organization. His enthusiasm was genuine, and his knowledge of construction processes was more comprehensive than I had expected. But I also noticed signs of the problems that had been documented in Mr. Harrison's reports. Several workstations that had been occupied during my previous visits with Grandpa Roberto were now empty, evidence of the employee turnover that Daniel had dismissed as resistance to positive changes. The remaining workers seemed less relaxed and collaborative than I remembered, their interactions more formal and guarded than the familial atmosphere that had characterized the company under my grandfather's leadership. I've had to make some tough personnel decisions, Daniel explained when I asked about the staffing changes. Some of the older guys weren't adapting to the faster pace and higher standards I've implemented. It's unfortunate, but you can't let sentimentality interfere with business efficiency. His characterization of veteran employees as obstacles to progress rather than valuable resources with institutional knowledge revealed how completely he had misunderstood the culture that had made Grandpa Roberto's business successful. The experienced workers hadn't been resistant to change. They had been trying to maintain quality standards that Daniel apparently viewed as unnecessarily restrictive. That evening, I called one of Grandpa Roberto's former employees, a man named Miguel, who had worked for the company for over 15 years before quitting shortly after Daniel took over. Miguel had always been respectful toward me during my visits with my grandfather, and I hoped he might provide insight into the situation, without realizing the significance of his information. "Your grandfather was a good man, mija," Miguel told me when I asked about his decision to leave the company. "He treated his workers like family, and he never asked us to do anything that would compromise our integrity or safety. The new management has different priorities, and I couldn't stay in a situation where I was being asked to cut corners that could hurt people or damage our reputation." He explained that Daniel had implemented policies designed to increase productivity and reduce costs, but these changes often came at the expense of the careful craftsmanship and ethical practices that had distinguished the company in a competitive market. Projects were being completed faster and cheaper, but the quality standards that had built decades of customer loyalty were being systematically eroded. "I hope things work out for your brother," Miguel concluded, "but I think your grandfather would be very disappointed in the direction the business is heading. He always said that reputation takes years to build and minutes to destroy, and I worry that those minutes are approaching faster than anyone realizes." His assessment confirmed my worst fears about Daniel's performance during his probationary period. Not only was he failing to meet the specific criteria outlined in Grandpa Roberto's conditional inheritance, but he was actively damaging the legacy that our grandfather had spent his lifetime building. The new semester began with the knowledge that Daniel's evaluation period would conclude in just a few weeks, and I still hadn't decided whether to warn him about the consequences he was facing. The moral complexity of the situation had only deepened as I learned more about the extent to which his management decisions were undermining everything Grandpa Roberto had worked to create. On one hand, family loyalty suggested that I should give Daniel the information he needed to change course before it was too late. He was my brother, and despite our different personalities and approaches to life, I didn't want to see him suffer the devastating consequences of losing an inheritance he believed was permanently his. On the other hand, warning him would feel like betraying Grandpa Roberto's carefully designed test of character and integrity. My grandfather had created this elaborate evaluation specifically to ensure that his life's work would go to someone who shared his values and would honor his legacy. Daniel's natural approach to business and responsibility had revealed character traits that suggested he wasn't the right person to continue what Grandpa Roberto had built. The decision became even more complicated when I considered the broader implications for justice and merit-based reward. Grandpa Roberto had apparently spent years observing both his grandchildren and had reached conclusions about our respective characters that were being validated by Daniel's performance during his probationary period. Warning my brother would essentially be helping him fake the integrity and judgment that should have come naturally if he were truly the right person to inherit such significant responsibility. As February approached, I realized that my decision about whether to intervene was itself becoming a defining moment in my understanding of moral responsibility and family obligation. Grandpa Roberto had created a test not just for Daniel, but for me as well, and the choice I made would reveal something fundamental about my own character and values. The phone call from Mr. Harrison came on a cold Tuesday morning in early February, exactly 6 months after the original will reading. His voice carried a gravity that immediately told me the evaluation period had reached its conclusion, and the results were not favorable for Daniel's continued ownership of the inherited assets. "Sarah, I think you know why I'm calling," he began. "The 6-month probationary period ends today, and based on all the reports I've received, Daniel has failed to meet the criteria your grandfather established for permanent ownership of the business and properties." The finality in his voice made the situation feel suddenly real in a way that months of anticipation hadn't prepared me for. Daniel was about to lose everything he thought was permanently his, and I was about to inherit wealth and responsibility that would change the entire trajectory of my life. "What happens next?" I asked, though I knew the answer would fundamentally alter my family's dynamics and my own future in ways I was still struggling to comprehend. Mr. Harrison's response would set in motion a series of events that would test every relationship in my family and force all of us to confront truths about character, merit, and the real meaning of inheritance that went far beyond simple financial considerations. Mr. Harrison's voice carried the weight of finality as he delivered the news that would change everything. The assets transfer to your trust effective immediately. I'll need you to come to Denver this weekend to sign the necessary paperwork and discuss the transition process. The reality hit me like a thunderbolt. In a matter of days, I would become the owner of a multi-million-dollar construction company, multiple rental properties, and substantial investment accounts. More importantly, I would become responsible for preserving the legacy of a man who had believed in me when my own family had overlooked my potential. "Does Daniel know yet?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm required to notify him today about the change in ownership status. Your grandfather's instructions were very specific about the timing and method of disclosure. Daniel will receive a certified letter explaining that his probationary period has ended, and the assets are being transferred according to the original estate plan." I could barely imagine Daniel's reaction to discovering that what he thought was permanently his had actually been a test he had failed. The shock would be devastating, but the humiliation of learning that his inheritance had been conditional all along would be even worse. "What about my parents?" I asked, dreading their response to news that would shatter their understanding of family hierarchy and merit-based success. "They'll be informed simultaneously. Your grandfather wanted everyone to understand that this outcome was based on objective evaluation of performance and character, not favoritism or arbitrary decision-making." That afternoon, I sat in my dorm room staring at my phone, knowing that at any moment it would start ringing with calls from family members who had just learned that everything they thought they knew about Grandpa Roberto's will had been wrong. The waiting felt interminable, each minute stretching with anticipation of the storm that was about to break. The first call came from my mother at 4:17 p.m., her voice shaking with emotion I had never heard before. "Sarah, something terrible has happened. There's been some kind of mistake with Grandpa Roberto's will. Mr. Harrison is saying that Daniel's inheritance was only temporary, and now they're trying to take everything away from him." Her characterization of the situation as a mistake revealed how completely my family had misunderstood the nature of Grandpa Roberto's estate planning. To them, Daniel's inheritance had been a foregone conclusion, and any challenge to that assumption must represent an error rather than the natural consequence of his performance during the evaluation period. "It's not a mistake, Mom," I said quietly. "Grandpa Roberto designed it this way intentionally. Daniel's inheritance was conditional on meeting certain requirements, and he didn't meet them." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by what sounded like my mother struggling to breathe. When she spoke again, her voice was barely recognizable. "You knew about this. You knew that Daniel might lose everything, and you didn't warn us." The accusation in her tone cut deep, but I had prepared for this moment during the months of carrying Grandpa Roberto's secret. I knew that Daniel was being evaluated, yes, but warning him would have defeated the purpose of the evaluation. Grandpa Roberto wanted to see Daniel's natural approach to responsibility and business management. "This is insane," my mother said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "Your grandfather left everything to you instead? How is that fair? Daniel has been working so hard, building the business, making it successful. You're just a college student with no experience in construction or property management." Her words stung because they reflected the same dismissive attitude toward my capabilities that had characterized my entire childhood. Even faced with evidence that Grandpa Roberto had trusted me with his life's work, my mother's first instinct was to question whether I deserved such responsibility. "Grandpa Roberto spent years observing both of us," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil. "He made his decision based on character and judgment, not just experience in construction. The conversation ended abruptly when my mother hung up, leaving me shaking with adrenaline and emotional exhaustion. Within minutes, my phone was ringing. Again, this time with Daniel's name on the caller ID. "What the hell did you do?" he screamed before I could even say hello. "How did you convince Grandpa Roberto to write me out of his will? What kind of lies did you tell him about me?" His immediate assumption that I had somehow manipulated our grandfather revealed how little he understood about the situation or his own role in creating it. The idea that his inheritance might have been lost through his own choices, rather than my interference, apparently hadn't occurred to him. "I didn't do anything, Daniel," I said, trying to project calm authority despite feeling overwhelmed by his rage. "Grandpa Roberto created conditions for your inheritance, and you didn't meet them. This outcome is based on your own performance over the past 6 months." "That's bullshit," he snarled. "I've been busting my ass to build that business. I've increased revenue, expanded operations, and created more jobs than the company has ever had. If that's not success, I don't know what is." His definition of success focused entirely on short-term metrics like revenue and expansion, ignoring the quality standards, employee relations, and ethical practices that had actually been the basis of his evaluation. Daniel had been judged by criteria he didn't understand because he had never learned to value the principles that had made Grandpa Roberto's business truly successful. "Success isn't just about making money quickly," I replied. "It's about building something sustainable while treating people fairly and maintaining integrity. Grandpa Roberto built his reputation over decades, and that reputation was being damaged by some of the changes you made." "You don't know anything about business," Daniel shot back. "You're a kid playing with theories you learned in textbooks. I'm the one who's been out there actually doing the work, making the tough decisions, dealing with real-world problems." The conversation continued in this vein for another 10 minutes, with Daniel alternating between rage at me personally and disbelief that his inheritance had been contingent on meeting standards he claimed were unrealistic. Nothing I said seemed to penetrate his conviction that he had been wronged rather than fairly evaluated. Over the following days, my family's response to the inheritance reversal revealed dynamics that had been hidden beneath years of surface. Harmony. My parents rallied around Daniel with protective fury, treating his loss as a tragedy that had befallen him rather than a consequence of his own choices. They spoke about the situation in terms of injustice and manipulation, unable to consider that Grandpa Roberto might have had legitimate reasons for his conditional bequest. My father called to inform me that they were consulting with lawyers about challenging the will, convinced that such an unusual arrangement must be legally vulnerable. When I pointed out that Grandpa Roberto had used experienced estate attorneys to structure his plan, my father accused me of being naive about legal complexities and family politics. "Your grandfather was old and possibly confused when he made these arrangements," my father said, his voice cold with barely controlled anger. "No reasonable person would set up such an elaborate scheme to trick his own grandson. We're going to fight this, and we're going to get Daniel back what's rightfully his." The threat of legal action added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. But Mr. Harrison assured me that Grandpa Roberto had anticipated such challenges and had structured his estate plan to withstand scrutiny. The conditional nature of Daniel's inheritance had been clearly documented, and the evaluation criteria had been objective and reasonable. The most painful aspect of the family crisis wasn't the anger or threats, but the complete lack of curiosity about why Grandpa Roberto had made such an unusual arrangement. No one asked what Daniel might have done to fail his evaluation, or what qualities Grandpa Roberto had seen in me that merited such trust. The family narrative focused entirely on the unfairness of the outcome, rather than the behavior that had produced it. 3 weeks after the inheritance transfer, I drove to Denver to meet with Mr. Harrison and begin the process of taking over responsibility for Grandpa Roberto's business empire. The meeting felt surreal, signing documents that made me the owner, of assets worth more than I had ever imagined possessing. Your grandfather left detailed instructions for the transition, Mr. Harrison explained as we reviewed the paperwork. He recommended that you spend the summer working directly with the business operations to understand how everything functions before making any major decisions. The practical aspects of inheriting a construction company while still in college were daunting, but Grandpa Roberto had apparently anticipated this challenge as well. His instructions included suggestions for interim management, educational resources for learning about construction and property management, and a network of trusted advisors who could guide me through the learning process. Most importantly, he had left detailed notes about his business philosophy and the principles that had guided his decision-making throughout his career. Reading these documents felt like having conversations with him about integrity, long-term thinking, and the responsibility that comes with employing other people and serving customers who trust you with significant investments. The first major decision I faced was what to do about the employees who had quit during Daniel's tenure, particularly Miguel and several other experienced workers whose departures had damaged the company's capacity and reputation. Reaching out to them felt like the right way to begin honoring Grandpa Roberto's values while rebuilding what Daniel had damaged. Miguel's response to my phone call was cautious but respectful. "I heard about the change in ownership," he said. "Carefully. Your grandfather was a good man, and I hope his legacy can be preserved." When I explained that I wanted to understand what had gone wrong during Daniel's management and how to restore the company's former standards, Miguel's tone warmed considerably. He agreed to meet with me to discuss the problems that had developed and the steps that would be needed to rebuild employee morale and customer confidence. Our conversation revealed the extent to which Daniel's pursuit of short-term profits had compromised the reputation that Grandpa Roberto had spent decades building. Customers were beginning to complain about quality issues. Safety shortcuts had created liability concerns, and the departure of experienced workers had left the company struggling to complete projects competently. "Your brother isn't a bad person," Miguel told me diplomatically, "but he didn't understand what made your grandfather's business special. He saw only the money coming in, not the relationships and standards that made that money possible." Over the following months, I split my time between college coursework and learning to manage the business I had inherited. The process was challenging, and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. Every decision I made with integrity and long-term thinking felt like honoring Grandpa Roberto's memory and validating his faith in my character. The rental properties required attention to maintenance issues that Daniel had deferred in favor of maximizing short-term cash flow. Restoring these properties to proper condition was expensive, but it rebuilt relationships with tenants and demonstrated the kind of responsible stewardship that Grandpa Roberto had always practiced. Gradually, former employees began returning to the company as word spread that management had changed and previous standards were being restored. Miguel came back as a supervisor, bringing with him the institutional knowledge and ethical foundation that had been the company's strength for so many years. My family's response to these developments was mixed. My parents remained convinced that I had somehow stolen Daniel's rightful inheritance, but they couldn't argue with the evidence that the business was becoming more stable and successful under my management. Daniel himself seemed to oscillate between resentment and grudging respect for what I was accomplishing. The legal challenge to the will eventually faded as my parents' attorneys explained that Grandpa Roberto's estate planning had been expertly executed and would be virtually impossible to overturn. The conditional nature of Daniel's inheritance had been clearly established, and the evaluation criteria had been reasonable and fairly applied. A year after inheriting Grandpa Roberto's legacy, I found myself reflecting on the profound way that his final gift had changed not just my financial situation, but my understanding of family, merit, and responsibility. He had given me more than money and property. He had given me the opportunity to prove myself worthy of trust and to continue work that had meaning beyond personal enrichment. The inheritance had also revealed truths about my family that were painful but necessary to acknowledge. The favoritism And different standards that had characterized my childhood were not just matters of perception. They reflected fundamental differences in how my parents valued different types of achievement and character. Daniel and I eventually developed a more honest relationship based on mutual respect rather than the hierarchical dynamic that had defined our childhood. He found success in a different field that better suited his personality and strengths, while I discovered a passion for business management and community responsibility that I had never known I possessed. My parents' adjustment to the new family dynamic was slower and more difficult, but over time they began to acknowledge that Grandpa Roberto's unusual bequest had actually been a profound expression of wisdom and fairness. The inheritance hadn't been about money. It had been about ensuring that his life's work would continue under guidance that honored his values and served the people who depended on his business for their livelihoods. Looking back, I realized that Grandpa Roberto's greatest gift hadn't been the construction company, the properties, or the investment accounts. His greatest gift had been the faith he had shown in my character and the opportunity he had given me to prove that his faith was justified. The inheritance had tested everyone involved, revealing our true natures and creating the possibility for more honest relationships based on who we actually were, rather than who we were expected to be. The golden child narrative that had defined my family for so long had been replaced by a more complex understanding of merit, responsibility, and the different ways that people can contribute to the world. Daniel's athletic achievements and natural charisma were valuable qualities, but they weren't the only measures of worth or the only predictors of success in situations requiring integrity and long-term thinking. My own quiet persistence and careful judgment, traits that had been overlooked during my childhood, proved to be exactly what was needed to continue Grandpa Roberto's legacy responsibly. The inheritance had given me the chance to discover capabilities I hadn't known I possessed, and to build something meaningful with the foundation he had provided. As I stood in the construction company office that had once belonged to my grandfather, now filled with employees who respected the standards we maintained and customers who trusted our work, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from earning something through character rather than receiving it through circumstance. Grandpa Roberto had structured his final gift to ensure that his legacy would go to someone who would honor it, and I was determined to prove every day that his faith in me had been justified. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.